brutal war. A weapon that is too perfect can actually become a strategic mistake. The MG34 is proof of a brutal paradox. In this video, we're going to explore why the most advanced machine gun of the early Second World War was both a source of pride and a dark shadow hanging over the Wehrmacht. From its multi-role design and the doctrine of the squad built around the machine gun to the reality of mass production, you'll see how the MG34 not only paved the way for Blitzkrieg, but also forced Germany to create something even more ruthless. Most people have heard about the terrifying effectiveness of German machine guns in World War II, but the reason they were so devastating against Allied troops had a lot to do with smaller details. How the guns were carried, how the ammunition was stored, how gun crews were trained, and even how entire squads were structured around their firepower all played a crucial role. Even after the MG42 appeared and quickly became famous, the MG34 continued to quietly serve right up to the final days of the war. And in this part, you'll see exactly why. We're going to trace its entire journey from a secret set of blueprints to its first steps onto the battlefield, how it worked in practice, and why it came to be seen as one of the most influential machine guns in 20th century military history. After the First World War, German military leaders quickly understood that if another conflict broke out, they could not walk into it with the same old weapons. They quietly began developing a completely new kind of machine gun, more modern, more flexible, and capable of filling multiple roles at once. On paper, the Treaty of Versailles tied their hands banning new artillery and machine gun development. But behind closed doors, German engineers and officers kept working doggedly. They wanted to replace the old water-cooled heavy machine guns bulky, slow, and suited only to trench warfare. Their goal was a single weapon that could be used in almost any situation, offense and defense, light enough for infantry to carry, but still powerful enough to be mounted on tanks, vehicles, and even aircraft, and effective enough to serve as a low-altitude anti-aircraft gun. It was an enormous ambition, and the MG34 was the first answer to that ambition. Meanwhile, many other countries, most notably the United States, still clung to the idea of one mission, one gun, the M2 for heavy fire, the M1919 for medium support, and the Browning automatic rifle bar as an automatic weapon carried by individual soldiers. The Germans chose a completely different path. They tried to build one single gun that could do all of those jobs. And as we'll see, they came very close to achieving that bold goal. A small group of German specialists was handpicked to develop the new weapon under conditions of absolute secrecy. By 1934, the finished design existed, and just 2 years later, it went into full-scale production. At that time, no other army in the world even knew the MG34 existed. When war broke out in Europe, around 50,000 had already been produced, a starting advantage that few opponents could ever hope to make up. The MG34 quickly became a core element in Germany's new way of war, fast coordinated blows, combining tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry. These were the first steps of what the world would later call Blitzkrieg. The gun made its first public debut in the Spanish Civil War, when a small number of early variants were sent to support the German-backed nationalist forces. Compared to the heavy water-cooled machine guns that many units were still using, the MG34 was lighter, faster, and far more flexible. From its first bursts of fire, it was clear this was not an ordinary weapon. From there, the MG34 appeared almost everywhere in the German armed forces. It was mounted on tanks, armored personnel carriers, and even on some aircraft. But most importantly, it became a pillar of the infantry. By 1941, the MG34 had become the standard machine gun across the front. In total, nearly 600,000 were produced during the war, making it the second most manufactured German machine gun, just behind the MG42. In German tactical doctrine, the infantry squad did not revolve around the rifleman, it revolved around the machine gun. Most soldiers carried the Kar 98 firing the same 8mm Mauser round as the MG34, but the final word on the battlefield belonged to the machine gun team. A standard squad of 10 men was organized entirely to support that firepower. At the center was the MG34 gunner. Beside him stood the assistant gunner, always ready to feed belts, change barrels, carry extra tools, and clear malfunctions. Both usually carried pistols as backup weapons. The squad leader, typically armed with an MP40 submachine gun, was responsible for directing movement and coordinating fire. The remaining men were riflemen and ammunition carriers, and their main job was to ensure that the machine gun was always protected, always supplied with ammunition, and always ready to cover the unit's advance. To guarantee a steady flow of ammunition, many squads were issued a horse or donkey with a small cart for carrying ammo. Each soldier was a link in that chain, and every link revolved around a very clear purpose, making sure the machine gun never fell silent when it was needed. In terms of fire discipline, German troops were trained to fire short bursts, usually from 7 to 10 rounds, to control barrel temperature, save ammunition, and maintain accuracy. In reality, especially when they had to stop dense infantry attacks, bursts tended to be much longer, putting significant strain on the weapon's mechanisms. On average, after about 250 rounds, the barrel needed to be changed to prevent overheating. In extreme circumstances, that number could be pushed to around 400 rounds, but at the cost of a very high risk of barrel damage. A well-drilled crew could change a barrel in just a few seconds, but those few seconds were also precious moments that the enemy could exploit to move closer. On the battlefield, every second that the gun was silent was a dangerous pause. For feeding ammunition, the MG34 used 50-round belts stored in metal drums, clipped to the left side of the gun. This arrangement kept the cartridges well protected, less prone to dust, and always ready to fire. Many other forces had no comparable drum system belts, were often left exposed, slung over the gunner's shoulder, easily contaminated by dirt and awkward to carry. In a war that demanded high tempo and constant fire, those seemingly minor details made a huge difference. Even the ammunition boxes were anything but ordinary. They were carefully designed leather-covered handles made them more comfortable to carry over long distances, and more importantly, the handles were positioned so that one man could carry 2 boxes in a single hand. That meant in one trip, a soldier could move 4 boxes around 1/200 rounds. When space needed to be saved, the handles folded flat against the box, allowing them to stack neatly in bunkers, tanks, or vehicles. The Allies had no equivalent system. German ammo boxes were also sealed against moisture and had fittings that allowed them to be mounted directly onto tripods. These things might sound like technical minutiae, but they created a clear advantage in prolonged engagements where ammunition consumption was enormous. Sometimes the edge comes from things even smaller than a bullet. The MG34 by itself was already a powerful weapon, but what lifted it to another level entirely was the Lafette mount. This was not just a 3-legged stand to rest the gun on. It turned the MG34 into a true heavy machine gun with the ability to control a wide beaten zone at long range. While most Allied tripods were simple, fixed into the ground and reinforced with sandbags, the Lafette was a sophisticated structure. Inside it was a recoil buffer that reduced the rearward kick and thus improved stability and accuracy, especially at longer ranges. One particularly striking feature was its remote trigger system. The gunner did not have to hold the weapon itself. He fired it through a trigger mounted on the tripod. This allowed the crew to stay lower to the ground and less exposed to enemy fire. In some situations, they could even tie a cord to the trigger and fire from cover behind an approach that was highly calculated. The mount also allowed the crew to preset direction and elevation. Once these settings were locked in, the MG34 could sweep across a predetermined field of fire, dominating a section of terrain without requiring the gunner to stay right behind it at all times. It was an ideal tool for ambushes, for covering retreats, or for locking down a critical choke point. On top of that, the Lafette could take an optical sight, allowing accurate fire out to about 2,000 meters. In the low-level anti-aircraft role, the MG34 used a spiderweb-style sight to track aircraft. A powerful gun is one thing. A thoroughly thought-out system built around it is another. And it was here that the Germans clearly outpaced many of their contemporaries. The whole Lafette setup weighed around 40 pounds and was far more complex than any tripod used by the Allies. But in return, it provided an extremely stable and effective firing platform, and importantly, it could also be used with the MG42. It was not just a gun stand, but an entire firepower platform. The MG34 held another key role. It was the primary machine gun mounted on German tanks and armored vehicles throughout the war. The main reason lay in how its barrel was changed. The MG42 had a faster barrel change system excellent for infantry, but it required the operator to open a side hatch and pull the barrel out sideways, which demanded a fair amount of space around the weapon. Inside the cramped turret of a tank, that space simply did not exist. The MG34's barrel, on the other hand, was pulled straight out the back, making it much easier for the crew to change it in the confined interior of an armored vehicle. Another notable feature was its fire selector system. The MG34 had a very distinctive two-stage trigger. Pulling the upper part fired single shots, while pulling the lower part switched to full automatic. Early versions even allowed the operator to adjust the rate of fire from about 600 to 900 rounds per minute, but this option was later removed because it was too complicated compared to what soldiers actually needed in combat. In other words, the MG34 had been designed as a precision tool, and the war forced it to be simplified in order to survive. So if the MG34 was so effective, why did it eventually step aside for the MG42 in most infantry units? The story starts not on the battlefield, but in the factories and machine shops. From the beginning, the MG34 was never meant for a long, grinding global war of attrition. It was more like a high-end watch than a cheap disposable combat tool. It demanded good steel, meticulous machining, and skilled labor. On average, finishing one MG34 took around 150 man-hours, an extravagant figure once the war entered its most intense phase. The MG42 followed a completely different path. By using many stamped parts and much less milling, it could be produced in roughly half the time. Put simply, the MG42 was Germany's answer to a harsh reality: they needed more guns faster and at lower cost. Out in the field, the differences became even clearer. With its very tight manufacturing tolerances, the MG34 performed brilliantly under clean conditions, but it turned picky in the face of dust, mud, and harsh weather. On the Eastern Front or in North Africa, where snow, mud, and sand were daily companions, that became a serious problem. The MG42, in contrast, was tougher, easier to clean and maintain, had an even higher rate of fire, and allowed barrels to be changed more quickly in the middle of a firefight. As the war dragged on, that was exactly the kind of weapon the front lines demanded. But the MG34 never truly disappeared. It continued to be produced until the end of the war. Some factories could not switch over to MG42 production immediately, so they kept building MG34s to avoid disruption. At the same time, the MG34 remained a very good fit for tanks and armored vehicles, and the units already equipped with it continued to need spare parts barrels and replacement components. When it arrived, the MG34 brought something entirely new. It was the first true general-purpose machine gun. That idea shaped the way modern armies have thought about machine guns ever since. Its successor, the MG42, may be more famous in popular memory, but the MG34 was the one that broke the trail. For its time, it was a step ahead in both design and doctrine. And nearly a century later, the imprint of the MG34 is still clearly visible in general-purpose machine guns around the world.